This World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, March 28th. We were planning to do this show on Signal, but Mike Waltz and Pete Hegseth weren't available. Seriously, Signalgate is the story that has kept on giving this week. Everyone has been talking about that chat by Trump's top national security officials that somehow included the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. So we'll dig into the story and ask, what does it tell us about the Trump administration's approach to national security and to security generally? Then we'll move on and talk about Turkey, where last week authorities arrested the very popular mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu. Hundreds of thousands of people have gone to the streets to protest every night in big cities and small towns, fearing, as many do, that the flimsy charges against the popular mayor who was going to run against President Erdogan for the presidency really actually signals the end of democracy. The economy is tanking, but somehow President Erdogan seems to be more intent than ever on holding on to power. How do we think this will play out? And then, finally, Greenland. This morning, the vice president and his wife landed in the far north of the island at a U.S. Air Force base called Bituvik. Used to be Thule. It's now the Bituvik Air Base there. He was going to check out security, interesting, on the far north where there are very few people. But everyone knows that what this is really about is Washington upping the pressure on both Greenland and Denmark, which is the sovereign over Greenland, to hand the island over to the United States as President Trump has demanded. So how is this playing in Greenland and in Europe? Here to help answer these questions are three reporters who are covering these stories. Nahal Toosi is senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Steve Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And Matt Kaminski is editor-in-large at Politico. Good morning, all. Good afternoon, Steve. Wonderful to see all three of you. What a week. No one knew about Signal, and some reporters and government officials who were using it, but now everybody must be downloading this app in the hope that they too will be added to some kind of chat. So, Nahal, you've been following the story closely, like everybody has, because it's difficult to miss. What do we make of this? What can we, we know the details. This was a discussion prior to military strikes that were going to be launched against the Houthis. Some very sensitive information was being shared. But what does it really tell us?
Well, thank you, Ivo. Look, a very brief recap. The President's National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, adds in Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to a Signal group chat with a whole bunch of other top Trump administration officials. The chat ends up including a bunch of details about the strikes that are planned on Houthi targets in Yemen. The information is obviously classified. I mean, clearly a lot of this stuff is classified. And at the end of the day, this discussion, which Mike Waltz labeled a PC small group, as in Principals Committee small group, is the type of thing that should not be happening on a chat, on an app. I mean, it's the type of thing that normally happens in the Situation Room with secure comms. But these folks had this discussion, and included even the vice president, talked about classified material. And although this chat is encrypted, it's quite likely many of these people had Signal on their personal phones, which can be hacked. And so this raises all sorts of security questions, procedural questions, and frankly, just general competence questions about this group of people who is making some of the most sensitive decisions in this country, affecting national security and the lives of people all around the world. When I first saw this, I almost was like, well, okay, is it April 1st yet? I was so confused. My jaw dropped. I mean, you don't have a lot of, if you've covered this stuff for a while, it takes a lot to make your jaw drop, but this one did it. And then, of course, I was incredibly jealous of Jeffrey Goldberg. I was sitting there thinking, my God, like, are there any people in this group with my initials? Why didn't I get invited? I felt, a little bit of the whole fear of missing out thing. But then, of course, it came down to this question of national security and whether this was the right form and whether they were, they had to be cognizant of what they're doing. I did a Q&A yesterday with Elon Goldenberg. He's like a national security insider in Washington. And one of the questions I asked him, I highly recommend everybody read this, but one of the questions I asked him was, why do you think nobody in this group spoke out and said, hey, guys, let's not do this here? You had the Secretary of State in this group. And he said, probably because they've been doing this for months. And that's right. The ease with which they offered up their points of contact, the ease with which this seemed like a completely natural thing, of course, raises the question of, what other types of signal groups have they had discussing these very important decisions? So look, there's a lot more to say, and I know you all have things to say. So I'm going to just, happy to cede the floor, please, everyone.
Yeah, I think, by the way, that last point you made is a very, very important one. It because Jeff Goldberg is at it, within a day of a new topic being raised, doesn't mean that the group at Signal was created, the original group was created for this purpose. I think there's a very good reason to believe that this group has been existing for a long time and they've been talking for a long time, which does raise this question of, if they've been doing that and they don't think what they did is particularly strange, what do the Chinese know? What do the Russians know? And what do so many other people know? Matt, take whatever angle on this story you want to take, because it is such a fascinating look. I'm sure that, like Nahal and everyone else, you wish that there was an MK somewhere in the U.S. government that mistakenly would have let you to be added to the chat. But Jeff was, and good for him.
It's one of those revealing moments, and it's revealing for so many different ways. Nahal mentioned, the idea that it's just the way these guys operate, a little bit playing things loosely. We're above government protocols. That's for someone else. The kind of bro-ish tone of this, and in some ways, I don't know, people making fun of the emojis, but, it's a touching, like, yeah, we hope that America does well. But for me, it's really most revealing in what it tells you about the divisions within the Trump administration. And it is revealing because they took it seriously. And so we saw, I think Hesketh and Waltz pretty much taking the Trump line. This is important for deterrence to move against the Houthis. And J.D. Vance, I think that was, for me, the most sort of eye-opening thing, that J.D. Vance going against the president, like even suggesting, I'm not even sure he knows what he's doing here because this is not our line on the Europeans, and Vance kind of being quite emotional and brutal as he has been in public, also in private. Like, why are we protecting the sort of free transit of sort of trade globally? Because that sends the wrong message against the Europeans. So Vance being kind of the isolationist in chief. And lastly, for me, what was very revealing was Stephen Miller and his kind of, even when he's in text, he's sort of humorless, saying, as the big guy decided, this is what we're doing, cut it out, So it's not often you get this kind of insight. And I think this is a proof, once again, the Trump administration is the most transparent presidency, both in Trump 1 and Trump 2, that we have probably ever seen in our lifetimes.
That's true. Just on the Stephen Miller piece, which is really interesting, and it was actually Gregory Graff, I think is his name, pointed this out. And I hadn't realized it, but Steve Miller was added to the chat only after the debate between Vance, Waltz, and Hesketh had played out. And I have this sense that Waltz wasn't able to shut down the vice president, and he had to appeal to who? A 39-year-old deputy chief of staff who happens to be the closest advisor to the president to come in and shut down the conversation. I thought that was just fascinating.
The only thing one thing I'd add there is that this is, I think, almost the underreported story of the attempts of the kind of isolationist Trump, Tucker Carlson / Don Jr. / JD Vance wing to clip the wings of the internationalists. You're seeing it with the attacks of the National Endowment for Democracy, the attacks on these surrogate broadcasters that they're killing through Doge. And here, and I think, and even now, the calls for Waltz to be fired. Remember, Waltz is actually seen as one of the quote unquote globalists who was more inclined to see American kind of leadership state, in Europe and across the world. So this could be one of the kind of consequences. Will this kind of lead to Vance being kind of a little bit pushed back? Or if actually Waltz ends up taking the fall, is it going to reinforce that sort of isolationist, the rising isolationist wing of this Trump Republican Party?
Now, before I go back to you, let me bring Steve in and sort of get, Steve, your perspective on the story. And I think importantly, since you're in Berlin, after all, the place that 10 years, 12 years ago, we found out that the U.S. was listening to Merkel's phone. So in that sense, it's not really surprising to them. But how do the Europeans react to this, both to the content, but also to, are we going to be able to deal with these people?
Well, the sense was that it was childish and reckless. I mean, completely reckless, and also bizarre in the arguments, because the United States has a blue water navy to preserve trade routes. That's what it does. That's in the American interests, right? I mean, because we have interests in the Middle East, we have interests everywhere. And just to blame this on Europe, Europe didn't ask them to bomb the Houthis, right? So why should Europe pay for anything? This was something the United States decided to do. And of course, China puts a lot of its export trade to Europe through those straits. Nobody's talking about making China pay, because they regard China as a peer equal or rival. You beat up on your colonies. You beat up on the people you perceive to be weak. So it's partly transactional, it's partly arrogant, it's partly reckless. I was also very struck by the Hegseth Vance thing. I think Matt's quite right, that Vance was going kind of off the reservation and saying, I hate doing things for the Europeans. And Hegseth was saying, yeah, they're pathetic. Now can we talk about bombing Yemen? Right? It was kind of like, yes, okay, fine. Now can we get back to the point? And I just found it, very bizarre. I'm also sure you're right, given the title of the group. It wasn't just a Houthi group, and I'm sure they're doing it constantly. And the other thing, former generals have pointed out to me, which is that all these principals have military aides who are with them all the time, who have the right communications equipment, right? Who have the phones, and whose job it is to say, don't use this, use what you're supposed to use. And it's very interesting that that didn't happen also. But generally, the Europeans throw up their hands because, privately, the Trump people say, yeah, we get it. NATO's okay, and Article 5's okay, and the umbrella's still there. But boy, we're going to go after Greenland. Or boy, we're going to do something else. So, I mean, there is this just sense of disconnect, and sense that, this is my metaphor, but it's like Trump is like King Lear in his senile period, bellowing at the waves, and Musk and Vance are these two evil daughters who are manipulating him to do what they want done. And we're kind of waiting for the good daughter Goneril to show up, and I don't know where she is.
I don't know where to take this metaphor, Steve. It's a good one, though. I don't know if Goneril is going to show up, probably. That's the point. Nahal, you wanted to jump in.
A couple of small things. Stephen Miller's power can't be underestimated in this administration. And he's the type of guy, I've written a lot about him. He doesn't like to leave a paper trail. He tends to do things behind the scenes. And he has this way of psychologically manipulating others by saying, often when he leads a meeting or starts a conversation, he says, we all know the president believes, or the president has said. And that has this effect of chilling debate And he uses this constantly. And it kind of drives some people crazy because he's also one of the main speechwriters for Trump. And so he often is crafting the words that Trump uses. So don't underestimate Stephen. Second, intelligence sharing. You have to wonder, if other countries are going to want to stop or limit their intelligence sharing with these folks, given the cavalier way in which they are sharing information with each other in these insecure ways. So, I mean, those are just a couple of thoughts. There's so much more to this, and I just, all I can say is they know how to reach me on Signal, and I'm happy to be added to any of these.
Phone lines are open.
Open, yeah. So on this intelligence, there's a bombshell report in the Wall Street Journal today that the intelligence about which, by the way, I think if you want to get as close to sources, not methods, or methods and sources, which is when Waltz reveals that the reason they know their target was theirs because he was seen to be walking into his girlfriend's apartment. I mean, it's remarkable that anybody would say that this is not classified, including the directors of Central and National Intelligence. But that intelligence came from the Israelis, according to the Wall Street Journal, who are absolutely pissed. As once again, this is not the first time, it's the second time. In the first Trump administration, you remember they were sharing information on Syria with the Russians, which came from the Israelis. It will nail the willingness of allies and others to share intelligence with the United States. It'll nail it shut, which will hurt our ability to get stuff done. It's really, really important. We can go on this story, and one which I think we have not spent enough time on. I still have no idea why these strikes happened. Even in the chat, there are 5 different explanations, none of them which make sense, including the fact that this was done to open up the sea lines of communication. The sea lines of communication are not open because basically the shipping companies have decided that the risks are too big and they'll just go around the Cape of Good Hope, and they figured out that they can do it faster now, etc. So it's a remarkable story that I think will keep on going, and we'll see whether there's any accountability in the end. But I want to move on because I know we can get stuck on this one for forever, because I'm stuck on it forever. So maybe that's why. But we'll continue it on Signal later. Matt, let's talk about Turkey. I mean, and it really is a big story that maybe in normal times would have been a little bigger, including the fact that on Tuesday, the President of the United States, meeting with designated ambassadors in the Oval Office, said that Turkey, there's a great country and it's run by a great man. This is a week after that great man arrested his political opponent, which tells you maybe more about Trump's state of mind than Erdogan's. But tell us what happened in Turkey, and where do you think this is going?
Well, it's truly springtime for autocrats in 2025. And this is also a very revealing story.
King Lear, springtime for autocrats. This is great.
I think Mel Brooks over Shakespeare any morning. But Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a very clever leader, and he timed this very well because he knew that for not just because of Trump in the White House, but for all kinds of reasons, if you're going to move against an opponent who's about 20 years younger than you, who has your old job as Istanbul mayor, and who represents the greatest sort of threat to your ability to continue on as president of Turkey. And the one thing you've had in Turkey, you've had the military has been cowed, the courts have been cowed, the media has been cowed, but actually Turkey's always had pretty free and fair elections going back throughout its history. It's never been by any means a perfect democracy. It's had multiple coups over the last, since Ataturk created modern Turkey in the 20s. But this has taken off, potentially a rival off the scene. Ironically, Erdogan himself was arrested when he was mayor of Istanbul, because then he presented the direct threat to the secular elites. And I think there may be, the danger is obvious. But for the time being, he is not going to feel pushback externally from the U.S. because Trump like strongman, but more importantly, nor from the Europeans, by the way, because they need Erdogan to keep the refugees out of mainland Europe, and because everyone sees Turkey as a very critical player. This actually, the segue from the Signal conversation is that you have a moment in the Middle East that is a truly, potentially epoch-defining, epoch-changing, and Turkey is one of the main players, having helped do more than anyone else to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And you probably will need Turkey on board as you think about this grander reordering that, Donald Trump, there is, I think, a larger strategy in some of the day-to-day madness, which is that Trump really wants, he sees the Abraham Accords in late 2020 as his signal foreign policy achievement of the first term, and he really wants to, bring about a normalization with Saudi Arabia to solve the Iranian problem, either by, destroying their ability to develop nuclear weapons, or by striking some sort of deal with Iran. And I think Iran and Turkey obviously is part of the equation. And I think the main argument for the attack on the Houthis is that this is going to make the Saudis pretty happy. It's a signal to Iran that we're willing to be tough along with Israel in the region. And I think that is the larger context. As for Turkey itself, just one last word on Turkey, which I spent a lot of time in Turkey in the first decade of Erdogan, and Erdogan actually was a very positive figure in that decade, a true modernizer, kind of took Turkey out of this, corrupt and a shabby sort of secular elite that were misruling the country for decades. And he truly modernizes. And the attack against him was that, no, he's an Islamist. He's going to sort of bring about a kind of Sharia state in Turkey. What ended up happening is that Erdogan is exactly like the authoritarian secular leaders themselves. He's a strong man. And because he has failed to keep the country modernized and failed to keep the economy strong, I think that ultimately could be his outdoing.
Thanks, Matt. I think you raise a lot of interesting questions here. I mean, Steve, one of the things, this surprised me in some ways, because in the last 2 years, Erdogan has written a high that is pretty remarkable. He finally got people in to turn the economy around and do the right thing on that. He's got this peace agreement with the Kurds and the PKK, and he is the undisputed victor when it comes to what happened in Syria. I mean, he is writing and sort of, he's got a pretty good relationship with the Europeans. He's actually talking to the Greeks on a regular basis, even though there are tensions there. And then he goes do this. In one way, Matt's probably right. He can do it because everything else is going right. On the other hand, this is the one thing that's probably going to lead people to say, well, we really can't work with this guy. So, I mean, how do the Europeans look at this? And sort of, is this analysis right? He was on this high, and maybe that's why he was able to do it, and he'll get away with it.
Yeah, and also I think the feeling is Trump doesn't care.
Well, that's
I mean, he's not going to get pressure from America. The other thing about Erdogan is, he lost the cities. This was a big blow to him. And he wants to regain the cities, particularly Istanbul, right? And this mayor was the most popular opposition figure in Turkey. And Erdogan's getting old. Presumably he's healthy. We don't know. So I think, I don't know what drove into it this particular minute, though the opposition party was about to name the mayor its presidential candidate. But in some ways, it's so blunt and brutal in the context of everything else you've said that I think he's likely to get away with it. I mean, a lot really will depend on how big the demonstrations are. Same thing in Israel. I'm always struck by, well, where's the demonstrations in America? I mean, I guess they're coming April 5th, supposedly, but you see massive demonstrations in other countries against autocracy. But right now, there's a kind of quiet. So obviously, the Turkish situation is really important to Washington. It's important to Syria. It's important to the Kurds. It's important to Israel. For all these reasons that Matt laid out very, very well, I think he's probably, at least in diplomatic terms, going to get away with it. But, the EU, Turkey's never going to join the EU. That's long gone as a possibility. And as it disappeared, so did the motivation for Turks to behave themselves in the way the EU would like them to in terms of rule of law and democracy and so on. So I think in the end, this is the culmination of an aging autocrat who does feel vulnerable, who worried about things slipping away, who, as you say, has managed very cleverly, I think, his foreign policies, but domestically, I think, was much, much weakened. And this is what he's done. We'll see what happens. I can't predict, but I don't see Washington screaming and yelling about it as it might have done before Trump was elected.
Just on the point of the EU, which is so important, and we should look back in history. Matt's right that the first 10 years that Erdogan was the modernizer. He was the guy who changed Turkey in a very positive way. And one of the driving forces was the prospect of EU membership. And it was the EU that shut it down. It was people like Van Rompuy, the Belgian prime minister, and then later the head of the EU, said, "Well, we can't have
Angela Merkel.
We can't have Muslims in our Christian Europe," which now has become the leitmotif of both Vladimir Putin and J.D. Vance. It's a disturbing part of the history and sort of a missed opportunity in some ways, because guess what? Europe needs the Turks. They're strong militarily, potentially, as they have to rely on themselves. Nahal, how do you look at it? You've looked at this region more from Iran and other places, but how do you see Erdogan as a figure, and how do you take what he's trying to do here from a political and strategic perspective?
Honestly, the three of you covered so many things that I was going to say, like literally like taking words out of my mouth. I'm like, I was going to say that. But look, in some ways, he's so ordinary. He's so predictable. I mean, I could tell you years ago, I saw this and people were like, "Oh no, he's a reformer." And I'm like, no, he's never going to leave. And sometimes it feels like he's never going to die. Look, this is it's power corrupting. It's men who think that they're irreplaceable. It's just so many classic themes in one guy. And I would say, maybe he hasn't been as Islamist as certain other Islamist leaders have been. But, if you're a woman in Turkey, you don't have the kind of freedom that you once did. There's definitely a more conservative culture overall. It's just a very, but the thing that kind of saves him over and over again is his geography. It's Turkey's role in NATO, which won't kick him out. There's no way. There's just all of these pieces, that the crucialness of it. I will say in Washington, frankly, the story has not gotten a lot of attention, but that's because right now, a lot of policy stories are not getting much attention because there's no bandwidth here, since everybody is focused on the fact that, the federal government is being dismantled piece by piece. You mentioned earlier, Ivo, that why did we bomb Yemen? Nobody's asking that question because they're focused more on the personnel and the process than the actual policy. So it's not getting a lot of attention here. And so I think at the end of the day, another phenomenon that I think is working to Erdogan's benefit is that these opposition movements just don't seem to work anymore. It's really pretty rare, not impossible, but rare, that these dictators get pushed out or toppled. I mean, I guess Bangladesh is a different example recently, but for the most part, opposition movements are scattered. They're infighting, and there's just not. I think he has the upper hand, even if these protests go on, even if there's boycotts and things like that.
If I could just sort of actually just amplify Hallie's point on, obviously the U.S. is kind of, it actually does matter that we're saying different things about, and it does matter that we're not funding, National Endowment for Democracy programs. That sends a signal. But what's really happening too is this kind of like global Putinism, that things that we thought were kind of, just sort of caged into Russia and all Putin's, his sort of all the rhetoric and the propaganda. Well, these are all just, color revolutions, and Democrats are really, stooges of the Americans and the Europeans. That's been adopted by us. And the Europeans aren't stepping in and sort of just to stand up for kind of quote unquote Western values. So we are in a kind of fairly nihilistic world order right now. And in a nihilistic world, someone like Erdogan is kind of has a much freer hand to do things that even in Turkey seemed unimaginable, let's say 5 years ago.
I see a column coming, Matt, called "Global Putinism." I see it, and if you hadn't seen it yet, write it, because I think there's a lot to that theme. And speaking of global Putinism, in some ways, I'm struck, Steve. I mean, let's turn to our last point on Greenland, which is all about Putinism. It's about imperialism. It's about mercantilism. It's about the idea that because you are a great power, you should own certain things that are in your neighborhood, even though the ostensible reason why the U.S. National Security Advisor, who I guess is no longer traveling with the vice president, was to see a dog sled race, which, if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd like to sell you. This is a big story in Europe, even if it's not a big story in the United States, and for good reason. So help us understand what the Greenland issue is all about, and why we should take it seriously, and what does it tell us about the relationship to the United States and Europe?
Well, I don't know who put the bug in President Trump's ear about Greenland, but it is going deep into his brain.
It was Louder.
Louder guy.
And
it was Ronald Louder.
Ronald Louder did it in 2018. According to
Ronald Louder just stick to Israel, for God's sake?
No, apparently not.
Anyway.
No. He did that according to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser in there.
I wouldn't question them at all.
No.
So
that's why I'm giving you the source.
No, but I mean, what's fascinating is the way Trump comes back and back and back years later to things that obsess him. Whether it's tariffs or German cars on American streets, whatever. So there is a serious issue with Greenland, right? Which is, as we all know, climate change. The Arctic ice is melting. Suddenly ships can go through places they really weren't going through before. Submarines can go through places where they weren't going through before. The famous gap, which I think it's called the Gyuk Gap, between Greenland and Iceland, where submarines from Russia and China and the UK can come down and undetected or less detected now, and end up sitting outside the United States. It's the way Russian nuclear submarines can escape with their bases, which are largely in the far north. So there are security issues. It's just that this is not, at least Putin has the excuse of Ruski Mir, Russian civilization world. There's nothing American about Greenland, right? And it is a little bit bizarre, I think. I can't tell sometimes with Trump whether it's the minerals under the ice that interest him, or it's the security argument somebody's made to him, or whether it's just that, it feels like it ought to be part of America because it's close to Canada. And if Canada is going to be part of America, then Greenland ought to be part of America. And the odd thing is the Greenlandics don't want it. I mean, there's been this great counter reaction, quite a lot of resentment. The Prime Minister of Greenland called this visit very aggressive. I don't know if it's really true, but I mean, the reports were that they were trying to find Greenlandic people who would welcome Usha Vance into their homes, and they were having trouble doing that. And people were promising demonstrations. So instead, they're just going to go to this dreary airbase, which is 70 years old, which is important for space and for missile detection. But under the 1951 agreements with Greenland and the United States can pretty much do whatever it wants for security up in Greenland. I mean, it wants to put new bases. It just has to tell the Danes. I mean, it's really not a big issue. But so it's very hard to understand the rhetoric. And then, of course, NATO, you know, they keep saying in private they're all for Article 5 and they love NATO, but Denmark is one of the best allies we have inside NATO. I mean, as everyone said, they've bought F-35s, they've sent soldiers to Iraq and Afghanistan. They've basically been very good allies. And so Trump talks about seizing Denmark's territory. So it has everybody kind of very confused. And this visit by Vance is, you know, I'm not sure who it really appeals to or what it's a precursor of, but it actually makes me very nervous because it's not like Greenland is full of soldiers, Danish soldiers. I mean, the US could take it over in 5 minutes. Now, I hope it doesn't. I don't think it will, because it really can do other things. Now, maybe in the Trump way, this is escalate to de-escalate. It's to force the Danes to do even more than they're already doing, and they're promising to do more. But it feels like they're pushing on an open door, and they don't want to accept the doors open. So it has people very confused. Me too.
Yeah. I mean, Nahal, there's this disconnect, it seems, as I think Steve rightly puts, between the strategic interest, which is real, but the reality that you can achieve that strategic interest in the same way we've achieved it for the last 70 years, which is cooperating with Denmark and Greenland and allowing to do what you want to do. And then this idea of the president who keeps saying we need to, quote, get Greenland. And sort of when you talk to people, including people in the State Department and Marco Rubio, who's been slightly more circumspect and about this, and as he has been on other issues, what do they think this is about?
You know, I think there's many theories. They include things like this is a negotiating tactic because he does want access to the minerals and he is worried about security. And so this is just about ultimately getting as much as we can on bases, et cetera, access that we can. Then there's a sense that, no, he's more serious than we expected. And at the very least, we should be preparing for the scenario of like a U.S. invasion. I don't know how many maps of Greenland the Pentagon has, probably quite a few, but you know, there's probably a signal chat about this somewhere. But you know, it's
NT, right? It's NT that needs to be added for that.
Yes. And so these things kind of come and go. And with the president, you know, he is motivated by a variety of things. He could be upset about the ridicule he got over the idea during his first administration. And so now he is just trying to make the point in a more serious way, just to say, no, you guys made fun of me then. I'm going to really go forward with it this time. I mean, that is part of what drives him. You know, I will say very quickly, I do think it's funny that they think, oh, there's all these new opportunities now because of climate change when they believe climate change is not real. So, okay, whatever. But one other point, there is this kind of strain in the GOP, and this is just a theory of owning the libs, right? So a lot of like what counts as strategy or doctrine or policy now is just about owning the libs, which is essentially like trolling people and getting a rise out of Democrats and people on the left in the United States. And I almost wonder if that is what's driving people like Vance and others who kind of, have infused that into their approach to politics domestically. And if that's kind of part of what they're putting toward their foreign policy in terms of let's own the liberals overseas by trolling them. And that's why my wife is going to go to a dog sledding race in Greenland because she just suddenly really cares about that. And I might just join her because I don't want her to have all the fun. I mean, there's this weird kind of, let's just use trolling as a foreign policy mechanism. And you see it, to be honest, in their tweets, their statements. I mean, like the stuff Marco Rubio is tweeting, I'm like, who wrote this? Who freaking wrote this? Like, this would not survive like a class 101 of international relations at Stuyvesant, like advanced global relations class or whatever. It's just maddening. So it's kind of amazing. And I have to wonder if all of that is just fusing. It's like, you know what, we can beat up on Greenland. And a lot of it then is like, how do you deal with a troll, right? My experience online is usually if you ignore the troll, they kind of get tired and they go away. I don't know if that works in international relations. And I don't understand, to be really frank, why other countries are not being tougher in their response. Why not say, you know what, Mr. Vance, we're not going to give you your visa. We're not going to allow this visit. We're not going to show up at this meeting. I don't get this. I think maybe the diplomatic gene is a little too strong in Europe and some of these other places. Maybe they just genuinely still believe that if they just talk it out, things will work out. Guys, it's been like 2.5 months and the damage has already been extraordinary. At what point are you going to stand up to the troll?
Matt, how do you see it?
I mean, I will concede that there may be a little bit of incoherence and contradictions built into the Trump method and his approach to foreign policy, as in most things. But I will take one for the team, Ivo, and I'm gonna try and articulate.
No, I always rely on you to do that.
I will try and articulate sort of that, and then caveat it, but articulate sort of a defense of this approach. I think the one thing you have to sort of give Trump credit for, both in Trump 1 and Trump 2, is putting on the agenda fully issues that should be discussed and should be addressed. As Steve sort of laid out, Greenland is strategically super important. The Chinese and Russians all over the place. And as it happens, the U.S. could do a lot more to help them, develop their mineral resources. That's in our strategic interest and our commercial interest. But again, the door is wide open to that. The U.S. could sort of expand its military presence there. No one is against it. We have one base. I think we had more troops in Greenland during the Cold War than we do now. So by all means, bring it back. Where they do get into trouble is if it's those two things are available. So it's really about redoing national borders and putting the U.S. flag on Greenland. That's a little bit more problematic. But maybe part of the genius here is it is sort of galvanizing the Europeans to be more serious about the world. The Danes, this is top issue in Denmark right now. As our policy toward Canada, maybe the genius there is that we actually want the Liberal Party to win because they were down 30 points in the polls only 2 months ago. Now they're likely to actually pull out this upset in Canada. It is about the Canadians, sort of about the Mexicans also being quite savvy. And so I just think with Trump, the crazy thing about Trump is that it's how do you block out some of the noise and focus in on what's really substantive and what's really kind of going to be bring about meaningful change. And I think it is too early to say whether this is going to blow up the transatlantic relationship. Yes, that is one path that seems very clear right now, but there's an alternative path that is different. Similarly on the Ukraine deal, similarly on his dealings with North America and on trade. The caveat really is, though, that unlike Trump 1, where he was willing to kind of flirt with disaster and then kind of settle on a fairly reasonable approach, whether it's on trade or on Ukraine or on NATO or on Asia. he seems much more willing to kind of push the envelope toward crazy, and that is why the whole world is a little bit on edge.
Push towards crazy, Nahal.
I just want to say that I heard this joke. I think it was actually something somebody actually said. Some Danish official was once asked, about Greenland, and he was talking about how difficult a terrain it is, what a really harsh environment and challenging area. And so someone asked him, well, what would you do if someone were to try to invade Greenland? And he said, if someone were to invade Greenland, we would immediately rescue them. So that's also worth keeping in mind.
All right, so that's what we're going to look forward to, the Greenlandic Denmark expedition to rescue the stranded American invasion of Greenland. It's been a surreal discussion, I must say, but I think this is the world we're living in. It's been also enlightening. I can't think of three people I would rather spend a Friday morning with to talk about what's happening in the world than Nahal Toosi of Politico, Steve Erlanger of the New York Times, Matt Kaminski of Politico, and all of you who have tuned in and watched and do so every week. We welcome your thoughts. We welcome your participation. We welcome you being part of this. And we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, you can find us all on Signal. Have a good weekend.